Hi, I'm Kamara Bahrain and you're watching Vantage Point, a special session being recorded on the sidelines of the International Conference on Global Movement of Moderates. And I'm very honored to have Dr. Charles E. Morrison, who is the president of the East-West Center, but he wears so many other hats. And there's just not enough time, but Dr. Morrison has been looking at Asia for a long time, and also the Pacific, and its relation to the United States of America. And at the same time, I would like also to tap the vast expertise, because I have met Dr. Morrison before at the Asia-Pacific Roundtable, and Asia is very much in your area of focus. And but this time around, if I were to ask you to look at it from the perspective of the movement of moderates, what from those years of experience looking at Asia since the 1960s will you pick up first to bring into discussion of this one?
Well, the first thing, and it's something that very much pleases me, is real leadership coming from a medium-sized or smaller country in Asia. I think for most of the last 50 years, Asia has been kind of passive, and still the major actors in the world are the United States, Western Europe, even some Middle Eastern countries. China today is more of an actor, but even China is still more passive than you would think. So for Malaysia to promote this movement of the moderates, I think is very good. The problem is the extremists all have something to motivate them. They all have an issue. But the moderates are usually reacting to the extremists.
Very comfortable.
So it's important for us to not be immoderate in our methods, in a sense, but to be bold. And I like Najib Razak's idea of bold moderates.
Okay, but if you come to think of it, it's only natural for the entities that have big power or big anything to be more active on the global stage.
Of course.
And Malaysia, for example, has always been a bit passive in that sense, because we don't really have much in comparison to the big powers. But we do have a lot of movement in the non-aligned entities, for example. So what would Malaysia have to offer to the world for them to come and join us on board this moderate movement?
Well, you know, I think the world is changing in many ways. And one of the ways it's changing is that, at least among countries, power will be more equitably distributed. And that makes it very complicated, because countries like the United States that sort of naturally identified their interests with global interests are much more like promoting their own individual interest. And so who's going to provide global leadership? That's the real question. And I think that it's going to many voices, including voices from smaller countries, from non-government and so forth, can provide this leadership. So I think in the area of kind of soft powers, meaning ideas, you know, even a country as small as Malta played a very big role in the law of the sea. So I think Malaysia also has roles that it can play. One area that we've talked about quite a bit here is Middle East, the Palestine issue. And somebody said, well, is the United States an honest broker? But the United States, of course, is not an honest broker, but the problem is it's been the only broker. And so it would be nice if a power like the United States could also cooperate with moderate Muslim powers, and we could broker together, because then there's brokers that have kind of biases on both sides.
There's a bit more light at the end of the tunnel in that respect, because we do know the focus of President Obama's administration in some term it as re-looking back at East Asia or Asia and the Asia-Pacific. And if you look at that, do you have more hope now that things will be better because of that? Because America has stated that intention?
Well, you know, of course, Mr. Obama's mother, his stepfather, his sister, and his brother-in-law all were at the East-West Center. So I'm kind of biased in that regard. But the president himself spent some of his formative years in Indonesia. I saw him recently and said, Selamat datang, and he said, so at least he can say some words. But he has he obviously has a real interest in Asia, which has been unusual for an American top political leaders. I think the concern I would have is that the so-called pivot policy, it should not be simply a military pivot policy.
Okay.
It needs to be economic, needs to be cultural, and it needs in particular to not just be a projection outward of what the U.S. wants, but an understanding going back into the United States so that we can be a more intelligent partner in this region.
Sometimes, even if somebody goes and get educated in Europe or in America, but you cannot take the person out of the upbringing that they have. So it's the same thing when people argue about international relations and global realignment of powers. Even though we don't have the Soviet Union anymore, but sometimes we tend to regress back and wanting to find a new Soviet Union. So when I go to meetings like Asia Pacific Roundtable, so instead of asking who's going to move with the United States of America, some people would readily put China as the new Soviet Union, and now you have to see conflict, and we have to look at the South China Sea, the 7 splits present there, and China is increasing its military spending. How do we get out of that kind of discourse and go more towards the moderate part?
Well, I think that is an important issue, and there are certainly people in the United States that think China is a new enemy, and the policy should be to contain China. That's not the policy of any recent administration. The policy is to work with the Chinese on issues of mutual concern. And it's somewhat successful and it somewhat isn't. I think when the Obama administration came, they wanted to work closely with the Chinese on climate change. But it was kind of that we can show China how climate change will affect their environment, and they should understand they have the same interests that we do. But in fact, China is at a different stage in its development, and so there's still fear in China that climate change policies will constrain China's development. So these building cooperation takes a long time. It's not something that can happen overnight. In the meantime, I think the U.S.-China relationship has become so important that both sides are very cautious. And so you can hear some immoderate rhetoric, but in the reality, the U.S. administration is not labeling China a currency manipulator. It is not trying to orient its defense policy to contain China. And the Chinese also, on their side, are being, I think, very careful to keep the lines of communication open. And you mentioned students. China has tens of thousands of students in the United States. The U.S. has a goal to have 100,000 students in China. So this is a very different kind of relationship than the U.S.-Soviet relationship was. It's a relationship of interdependence, both sides benefiting.
I have to go for the first commercial break, but once we are back, I'd like to use your vast knowledge and expertise to also comment on, maybe ironically, we talk about international relations, but so much so, now in the 21st century, the pressure of domestic politics has come up more into the focus of influencing international policies and relations, for example. So if I can tie that to what Professor Kishore Mahbubani said today, when he said that, look at Newt Gingrich, he's a PhD holder, but look at what he said about the Palestinians, for example. And if the Republican takes over the seat, for example, building movement of moderates and partnership and linkages takes a long time. But the political cycle of the domestic political situation, how does that bear into that equation? We'll discuss after this short break. Thank you for still watching Vantage Point. I'm still here with Dr. Charles Morrison. And if I can go back to the role of the pressures, maybe more aptly, of domestic politics. For example, if you take America, the Tea Party movement and the debate domestically about foreign relations, statements about China being said politically and all that. So we do acknowledge that this is a long road that we're embarking upon. But election cycle is 5 years, for example.
Well, I think democratic systems like the United States have a lot of noise. And very often that noise creates misunderstandings. And I'm afraid to criticize the news media in front of you, but
no, it's okay.
But if a candidate or a senator makes a provocative statement, that's much more likely to appear
That's news.
in the media than the normal run-of-the-mill statement. So I actually think that the policies in the U.S. have tended to be much more constrained than the noise that you hear. And you mentioned Dr. Kishore Mahbani and his comment about Newt Gingrich talking about the Palestine constructed people. But Newt Gingrich has a ceiling of about 25% of even Republican voters.
Okay, all right.
He's not a particular...
I'll give you that, yes. But I guess if we were to embrace the concept of moderation, even the extreme from the right or the left of the political spectrum must be heard, must be allowed to air their views.
Well, that's absolutely right. And you know, I hate to say it, but moderates to some extent depend on extremists. Take the civil rights movement in the United States. Martin Luther King was a moderate.
Yes.
Malcolm X was an extremist.
Yes.
Now, would have people listened to Martin Luther King except for the extremists? I'm not sure. You know, to some extent, the threat of the extremists strengthened the voice of the moderates. So, in a system that is democratic, and I think democracy is very important to containing violence, because if people have no way to redress grievances, legitimate grievances, will turn to violence, and they'll have sympathizers within the broader population. So you need to have extreme points of view brought into the political dialogue. And sometimes it takes a long time. 150 years ago, there were extremists in the United States that conducted terrorist acts.
Yes.
They conducted terrorist acts because they felt their cause was so just. The cause was to end slavery.
Yes.
Now, today, we can say they were right. But you know, at the time they were persecuted for their views.
So, when we see that in the national spectrum, maybe you can easily put that into perspective. But when we layer and link it across globally, because this is the global movement of moderates, what's not sensitive in the United States of America being picked up by the media or even the internet and put across here, then people here will be very angry. So, what kind of institution or whatever movement it is, who would be the mediator of this?
Well, first of all, don't expect perfection. We have a messy world, and there'll be extremist voices always in that world, and there'll always be some level of violence. And the real important thing is to not allow that to get out of hand, and to have huge incidents where thousands of innocent people die. And so I think that all kinds of institutions are created or need to be created. Look at ASEAN. ASEAN, some people would say, well, the real accomplishments of ASEAN aren't that great, despite how many decades it's been in existence. But I would say what it has done is provided links across the Southeast Asian countries. And when leaders meet, they don't want bad meetings. So if Indonesia and Malaysia are having a little tiff, you know, the leaders meet in ASEAN, and they tend to, you know, find some way to reduce the level of tension. So we do have problems, and the media creates kind of spikes, but often they're quite volatile, and they easily appear and they easily go away. The real problem is issues that are serious, remain decade after decade, deepen, fester. They can really do damage to international relations.
But I guess the key is still engagement, continuous engagement.
Absolutely.
Would you say that in the case of the military junta in Myanmar or Burma, which is now technically a civilian government, is an example of where, rather than taking the military or the violent way of solving that, continuous engagement, a lot of frustrating times for America, for even Malaysia playing the mediator role. But at least you're seeing progress.
I don't think anyone proposed a military solution to deal with the situation there, but it took a long time to do. Ultimately, it worked out. But I'm not sure that we should have we may have been a little too tolerant there because an awful lot of damage was done in the meantime. So Burma is a long way behind at the present
That's
time.
why if I go back to the zone of peace, of freedom and neutrality, the ZOFAN policy of ASEAN,
Right.
it worked for a lot of things, but especially the younger generation saying,
Yeah.
we cannot just stand by.
Yeah.
What are we doing? But even for Myanmar,
Yeah.
like what you're saying, we want change faster.
Yeah, and that's what happens with the integration process in ASEAN. It's not intervening in a sense of military engagement, but it's kind of intervening in a sense that ideas cross borders, and people have interests, and so ASEAN has like human rights mechanism now,
Okay.
and those ideas we hope will change, be agents of change in ways that are positive.
You have looked at Indonesia closely too.
Not
And
really.
in a sense, because of the background of President Obama and the international relations. And would the test for ASEAN be when the GDP growth of Indonesia is getting higher and higher, and they are going to claim, maybe to an extent, even if it's not government, someone else, being the big brother of the region? So would you see that as influencing the equation in Southeast Asia?
Well, it's just the facts of international life that there's going to be some bigger countries and some smaller countries. And it's always a challenge for the smaller countries to live with the bigger countries. And as somebody who comes from a bigger country, the challenge for the bigger countries is that we're always going to be targets of criticism for either doing things or not doing things.
Okay.
So I actually don't see Indonesia as an aggressive country. And I think what's the main story in Indonesia is it's been changing, and it's changing in ways that make it more like Malaysia. Of course, democratic, free press. It has growing income, and so I think it'll be a better partner than it was before.
I have to go for the last commercial break, but once we are back, because it was mentioned also by Prime Minister Dr. Sri Muhammad Najib that we're not only talking about conflict resolutions in between two entities or whether it involves military might, but also moderation in terms of the global economy. Wall Street was mentioned, even though there was not a single shot fired, for example. So I'd like to tap into your views on how you see, is it a new global financial architecture? What kind of moderation we can put onto the system? That after this short break. Thank you for still watching Vantage Point. Dr. Morrison, we have a few minutes left. If I were to put the global movement of moderates to really look at the global economy, there's a lot of imbalances there, and after the subprime crisis, even us in the media locally here have problem trying to explain to the people why is it that the subprime crisis happened. You see, banks here, people know that it's so hard to get loans from bank. But here was a crisis that bank were giving loan, and it's called subprime because you don't lend to the prime candidates. You lend to those who really actually cannot afford to have that loan. But whatever it is, the impact of it until now, we're discussing it. So it was said at this conference also on the role of Wall Street, the financial market versus the real market. So the role of moderation there.
Well, I myself tend to blame less the bankers and the financial people who were actually operating within the legal limits of the time, and more on the government regulators and the Congress, the political leaders, for failing to have a regulatory system that contained the immoderation that we saw in the financial markets. But I think this is a really important issue for moderates, and I'm glad that Prime Minister Najib included this in the agenda. Because first of all, when you think back on history, the Nazi movement of the 1930s got its start because of the Depression, really. And just think of all the problems. Those were the worst terrorists in global history. Probably there would have been no Israel where it is without the Nazis. There are lots of problems that still exist because of that. And so it's really important that we try to keep the financial system growing. It needs ability to innovate and change, but we have to try to also regulate it properly. And one of the problems is it's so complicated, and innovators think up new derivatives, you
Yes.
know, and
Agreed.
so we often only find out afterwards how dangerous the situation has been. And the other big problem, economic problem, that I would see is the global income inequalities within countries. China, for example, there has a higher Gini coefficient now, meaning large income inequalities, than any North American or European country. It's almost on Latin American scales.
Yes.
And this is something Chinese leaders are very worried about. But it also represents kind of greed and the failure of the Chinese system as it has evolved from a Marxist system to a capitalist system to contain a certain amount of speculation and wealth acquisition.
Would the interdependence of economy between US and China, or China and India, India and Southeast Asia, force this finding of solutions moderately for the global economic
Well,
system?
I think it does. Right now we're kind of focused on just the euro crisis, but the euro crisis has to be resolved within a broader framework, and Asia-Pacific countries are very vulnerable, as is the United States, to what happens in Europe, what happened earlier in the United States, what happened in 98, 99 in Asia. So a financial crisis can break out anywhere, and it is a global system. Money moves very rapidly around the world, and so we do need to find a global solution, not a regional solution for this.
Might as well talk about also, once we are on the global solution, climate change, for example. You know, it's a must-address issue. But we look at Kyoto and then what happened in Cancun. So how do you see this? Because one of the main topic for the younger generation is sustainability. And they will hold all leaders of the current regimes everywhere accountable for what's going to happen in the future.
Well, and I think the biggest challenge is to find a way to price carbon. Take here in Malaysia. Malaysia has one of the highest use of carbons at its income level in the world, about the French level of CO2 emissions, but Malaysia still doesn't have the average income of France. But the biggest culprits are the US, Australia, and Canada in terms of per capita CO2 emissions. And even though the US did not sign the Kyoto Protocol, actually its emissions have not grown that much. Of course, Canada's did sign, and Canada's grew even more. So it's not necessarily whether you sign a treaty or not. It's much more the actions that you take at the domestic level. And for that, you need moderates. You need moderates that are linked together and in different countries to work together. Because I think it's going to be less an international treaty and more what each country is able to do at its own level. So just on that final thing, I think the next goal for the movement of moderates is to move from this kind of large-scale dialogue to really focusing on some very specific issues where moderates can make a difference.
Before I let you go, after the Arab Spring, where one person can spark changes that revolutionaries were trying to have but didn't get it to be done, but one guy burning up himself, and you see a sea of change in the Middle East. People to people now becoming more important than ever. Individual has got more speed. Terrorists will argue that the system shut us out. The only way for us to get your attention is to do this atrocious act. But nowadays, communication technologies and the movement of the people have taken that excuse away.
Well, and you can see that a terrorist act, blowing up an innocent person, most people in the world will be appalled by that act. But to blow up yourself, to take action that is nonviolent is much more effective, I think, in actually mobilizing public opinion in your own country or outside.
So the empowerment is not just on the government nowadays, but actually everybody. If you think that you are the moderate, you must come out, stand up, speak and be counted.
I hope so. I think we need lots of moderates tackling issues and showing courage.
So thank you so much, Dr. Morrison, for making time to be on Vantage Point. It's always a pleasure.
Nice to see you.
Hope to see you in the Asia Pacific Roundtable in Malaysia.